With the ALP and the coalition share of the vote going down from what is a usual 90% to less than 70%, and compounded by a lack of representation for the remaining 30%, it really brings into question the legitimacy not only of the newly elected Labor government, but Australia's political system at large, especially when very few countries around the world throw in compulsory voting as part of their political system. Now, this gives it little legitimacy, according to political commentator and legal expert Anka Sahin. Welcome, Anka. I believe you're all the way over in Turkey at the moment.
I am, Michael. I couldn't wait to get out once the borders opened. As you know, I was, or me and many others I was originally stuck overseas. Then finally, when I was able to make my way back home, I then got stuck in Australia and separated from my wife and child for 14 long months. So as soon as I could, I got out.
All right, Anka, Australia's political system, where are we going wrong? Where are we going right?
Well, look, this election has certainly been a very interesting one, and as you've said, the share of the vote that the two majors have enjoyed in the past has certainly gone down, and at the same time, what we're seeing is an increase in the share of the vote for minor parties, for independents, and also somewhat worryingly, an increase in informal or invalid voting, and that's a concern. I have pointed out before just how complicated our electoral systems can be, and they are different at lower house and upper house levels too, and how complicated they can be for first-time voters, even if they're Australian born, it doesn't really matter, and also first-time voters who may have been recent migrants who have recently become Australian citizens, and therefore not only have the right to vote, but under our mandatory voting, they have to vote. So you got a situation where as a recent migrant, when you're a permanent resident, you're locked out of the process, and once you're a citizen, you must vote, otherwise we'll fine you. But the system is complicated. So what we're seeing in Australia is overall growing dissatisfaction with the increasingly similar offerings of the two major parties, but at the same time, old habits die hard. And that's a fact. People know that it's particularly at lower house level, it's not easy for smaller parties to win representation. So sometimes people who think along the lines of, oh, well, if I turn away from the major party that I have traditionally voted for, it will only help the other side get in. So I must just stay with this devil that I know. And so I think the real level of dissatisfaction is even higher than what the results are showing us. And 70%, compared to 95 is quite low. But if we had a different system in place that allowed the smaller players to be represented fairly, I think we would have seen something amounting to almost a revolution.
Yeah, we definitely saw the minor parties pick up a huge amount. Like we said, there was 30% that was spread across the other ones. The other interesting point that you raise is, as you say, migrants, people whose English isn't their first language. It is hard, but going even further back, I went to school. I didn't go to school for a long time. I'm not saying I was a stellar student, but our voting system and civics isn't a great part of our curriculum or educational system. How much do you think that plays into it?
I think that plays a very big role. Sometimes you hear about interviews with ordinary people on the street where they get asked a very simple question about, how the electoral system works, and you get answers which clearly indicate that they have little idea. I mean, they might know, for example, that they have to number every box, but exactly what the implications of that is in terms of how they do the numbering and what the different outcomes would be based on how they do that. I don't know if everyone's aware, and yes, you're right, it's not part of the curriculum, and it's also not offered as a form of civics education to new citizens either. So, you know, when you come into the Australian polity as a new citizen, you're expected to be up to date with the laws. You're expected to know the Constitution. You're expected to know your rights and responsibilities with regard to, being a citizen of Australia. You certainly, you're obliged to vote. It's not like you can opt out, and you're expected to know how the voting system works. But who exactly is going to teach you? There's just no. I mean, the next, you could ask an Australian mate of yours, and who knows how much they know, whether they can actually pass on that information or knowledge to you, or they themselves might be slightly misled.
Yeah. Anka, as a immigration lawyer, is it part of the citizenship test?
No. There are questions in the citizenship test with regard to I don't know, the flags, the parliament, various different, what the Governor General does and those sorts of things, but nothing to do with elections, or nothing to do with how elections actually work.
In America, this would be tantamount to their restriction of black voter rights, or where they're trying to restrict it in some of the Republican things by making voter access harder with putting different hurdles and photo IDs and all the rest of it. There's a fair chance our migrant population isn't being represented as strongly as what they possibly should be.
No, that's absolutely right. And there are a number of reasons for that. And one is, of course, politics is very much based on existing networks and getting into those networks and perhaps getting into it at an early enough sort of time or early enough period in your life that you can progress through, maybe from volunteer to staffer to something else, and perhaps eventually have a chance to run for office yourself, whether that's at local level, state level, or if you're really lucky, maybe at federal level. But the other side of that equation, of course, that part is hard for migrants, particularly first generation. But the other side of it is that when a new migrant, or somebody who has permanent residence in Australia, becomes a citizen, chances are the great majority of them will be eligible to vote, but will not be eligible to be elected to federal parliament. Because we have Section 44 of the Constitution, which says that if you have any allegiance to a foreign power, you're automatically disqualified from being able to nominate for and be elected to federal parliament. Now that disqualification doesn't exist at state level, doesn't exist at local level for council and things like that. Certainly does at federal level, and it would be a mistake to assume that the fact that our parliament isn't broadly reflective of the diversity of our society is only due to Section 44. That would be a reductionist approach, and it wouldn't be accurate. I'm convinced that Section 44 does play a role, and in the Western world, there's no other country where nearly 50% of the population potentially faces this sort of disenfranchisement at federal parliament level. And where do I get that 50% from? I'm getting that from the fact that 1 in 2 Australians has a parent born overseas. So that means approximately 1 in 2 Australians will have some connection to another country and potentially a claim to the citizenship of that country. And even if they don't exercise that claim, they have never held a passport or never even applied for the citizenship of that country, Section 44 still serves to disqualify them from even trying. So it certainly is an obstacle, but it's not the only one.
Yeah, it's not really a glowing endorsement of our much heralded multicultural society that we live and are proud of. Now, what's the answer here, Anka? Would you say that we need to go to, say, like New Zealand or Germany with the multi-representation proportional rather than the preferential?
Personally, yes. I don't know how well known those systems are across Australia. I know that the approximately 660,000 or 700,000 New Zealanders who live in Australia would probably have a fairly good idea as to how the electoral system there works. When New Zealand made the switch, you'd be aware that pre-1996, New Zealand made the switch to mixed member proportional back then, and that was done through a referendum, which was successful. There was a massive educational effort, if you like, an effort to a public relations campaign to get out information about how the new system works and what are the implications. Now, New Zealand did a very good job of that, because I'm a New Zealand citizen as well, and I lived in New Zealand for almost 10 years, at various parts of the periods of my life. I am quite familiar with the level of, I guess, awareness that exists in New Zealand society with regard to how the electoral system works. They do have the additional advantage of the system being a lot easier to comprehend, for sure. But the fact that public relations campaign, that educational campaign that was run at the time, was extremely successful. So if you take any New Zealander on the street and ask them, well, how do you vote, and what are the implications? You get your two votes, one for your representative and the other for your preferred party. They'll be able to give you something of an idea, even if they're not necessarily into politics, if you like. They'll still be able to give you some idea of how it works. So that certainly it was a success. In Australia, well, the systems we have been around for a long time, but as you've also touched upon right at the start, they were designed, or they were put in place at a time when the dynamics of the political environment were very, very different. And we've got to a stage where now the Australian society is a lot more pluralistic, a lot more diverse. And there are certainly parties out there that represent different approaches and ideologies and worldviews out there, and they are simply not being represented either at lower house level or upper house level, in line with the support that they have from the people. Yep. And at various times, the Greens were one of the biggest losers of this. They get around 10% of the vote, but until these elections used to only get one MP at lower house level. And as we have seen in these elections, One Nation and the UAP getting 5% of the vote, just above 5% of the vote, and pretty much the same or even a percent higher than the Nationals, for example, who end up getting 10 MPs on the back of 4% of the vote, while the UAP and One Nation get nothing for this similar level of the vote, or even higher. And look, most Australians, as I have said in my posts before, most Australians are very fair-minded, and if you put this across to them and say, look, do you feel this is fair? I think most people, hand on heart, will say, no, it's not. Whether they have any sympathy to those parties or not, that's beside the point.
Yeah. Well, what do you say to the people who say that preferential voting is basically the same as walking into a restaurant and saying, well, I'll have that. Sorry, we're sold out. Well, I'll have that. Sorry, that's also. So, well, I'll have that. Well, I definitely don't want that. I'll have that. So your vote still counts. You get something to eat. You mightn't have got your first choice. Or should it only be, unless you're 100% aligned with the party, unless the party has really earned your trust and your support, don't vote for them?
Well, look, it's not a terrible system, preferential voting, and I personally believe that it's for example a great system to elect a president. Not that we have a president in Australia, maybe in the future we will, but I feel that it's a great system to elect a president, because when you have a preferential system, particularly the instant runoff voting that we have at the lower house level, because the Senate is different with its quotas and different dynamics that come into play. But at the lower house level, we have what we call instant runoff voting, where we number all the candidates, and it's that particular type of preferential voting, because there are different types of preferential voting, and that's one particular version of it. That particular version is designed to result in the election of the least unacceptable person to be the representative of a particular electorate. Now, the least unacceptable doesn't mean the most acceptable. They're completely different things. So the least unacceptable is kind of like the least offensive, the one that everyone can live with, but not necessarily the one that the majority want as such.
Does that keep us a more centrist society? Does it stop, like we see in some of the countries that have problems, I would say, with their, not democracy, but different factions within society? So we see the extreme right and the extreme left. We see Marine Pen versus Macron going. We see it in the Jewish, the Israelis, where it's one. We see Hezbollah, you know, recently, have just in the most recent election have lost seats, and the Christians have picked up some in Lebanon. Does it keep us more centrist then with the least worst, so that we don't go, they're the ones that are right out the edge of what I want, versus, what do you say to that?
There is certainly an element of that. Yes, it keeps politics more sort of concentrated around the political center of the spectrum, for sure. Yes, it has an element of that, but it also leads to overrepresentation of the bigger parties, because in a preferential system like that particular one, the IRV, unless your candidate comes first or second, the preferences do not get distributed to them, because the first or second are, in most cases, in 95% of the cases, the first and second are the ones who end up going head to head at the final stage of the vote distribution. So yes, what it then leads to is these parties that have been around for a long time, which explains why, for example, the Nationals get 10 MPs on the back of 4% of the vote, while with a higher level of the vote, the UAP and One Nation, because they haven't been around long enough and they haven't had that opportunity to consolidate their votes in particular electorates, do not get the same level of representation. I don't think anyone would sit and say preferential voting and different types of preferential voting, including the version that we use at the lower house level, is a terrible system. It is not, but it's a system designed for a particular purpose. It doesn't do the job that I think the vast majority of the Australian people would expect it to. I mean, imagine if you're in that 30% that voted against the two majors. In fact, it's more like 32% in this election. And remember, it was only 24.7 in the last election. So it went from 24.7 to up to 32. That's like a 1/3 increase. Imagine if the same increase were to happen in 2025, you'd be looking at potentially 40% of the two majors. I mean, going forward, this is unsustainable. We can't continue with this system and still expect the two parties to enjoy the same level of legitimacy and support and enthusiasm from the people that they have in the past, when 40% of the people don't want to see them forming government.
Yeah, and that's one of the main things I think we need to focus on, is the trust and the belief in the system that, well, I may not have lost, but that's how democracy works. More went for it than didn't. Now, we've seen reform happen at a state level. We've seen the group voting ticket, so the ability of parties to be able to direct preferences, that went federally. But Western Australia only recently just did it. And some of the problems that flowed from that, we saw somebody elected to the upper house in Western Australia with 90 first votes. So 90 people in Western Australia put somebody in power, 90, and the rest was done on preferences. In Victoria, we still have the group voting tickets. They've had an inquiry. Magically, the Labor Andrews government has said, well, it's involved and it's complex. We don't think we should attack it before this coming election. And we've also seen now there are parties in the Senate that during lockdowns wielded tremendous power. That one got in was Rod Barton in the Transport Matters Party with 1/5 of 1% of the population that said, he's my man. And we saw some of the support he gave Andrews. We saw the Animal Justice Party get in with, I think it was about 1.1%. Do we need the federal election? Do we need the federal government to take over the entire electoral system, put it in, as you said, as they did in New Zealand, run a campaign, put it in civics, put it in the citizenship test and get on with it to restore faith? Do you think, Anka?
Look, that would be an ideal scenario. Now, in Australia, change always takes time, and sometimes not years, sometimes decades for change of that sort to happen. I think we will eventually get to a point where things will become even more unsustainable than they are now, even compared to 2019, where we are now with the result of these elections is very different to 2019, because in 2019, the coalition that ultimately got in just by the skin of their teeth got in, I think they had 76 seats, if I remember correctly, at federal level. And that was on the back of about 41.4% of the vote. Now, we've got a situation now where the ALP have got in with pretty much the same number of MPs. It looks like they'll end up with 76. It's to be confirmed, but it looks that way. With only 32.8% of the vote. And that's the lowest first preference vote that they've had since 1934, back when there was a splinter from Labor, which led to that really low level of votes for them in that particular elections. So I think things have already moved on even from 2019. We're going in that direction where people will turn around and say, look, it just doesn't make sense for a party to win 5% of the vote, 6% of the vote, and have no representation at lower house level, while a representative from a minor party could win, as you said, 1/5 of 1% of the vote and somehow get in to be represented at upper house level. It just doesn't make sense, so it's between two extremes. Either you get people purporting to represent you who haven't actually got any popular support behind them, versus you've got parties that command, even in this system that is stacked in favor of the majors and has been for a long time, even in this sort of system, parties getting 5% of the vote, 6% of the vote, in the case of the Greens, 12% of the vote, and not getting representation that is proportionate to their share of the vote. There will come a point where people will say, hold on, this is just, it's unfair. It's not what the people want, and we'll run into this issue of legitimacy. It's only now maybe beginning to be talked about. It's only in these elections, and not so much in that, using that terminology, because that's the terminology that I use, is legitimacy. But people have been pointing out in various articles and posts and things like that, the fact that majority government with such a low percentage of the first preferences is well, unheard of, not just in the world, but also in Australia. It's the first time we've ever had this.
Yeah, and the last thing we want is Australians barracking, to use our Aussie rule soon, barracking against the government, because we need our government to do well. And hopefully, I'm a bit of a Republican. Hopefully, when we embrace the Republic, maybe it'll be part of their charter for a whole new review. But anyway, Anka, it's been a fascinating discussion, and I'll look forward to catching up again. Thanks so much for your time.
No problem, Michael. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. All the best.